Good evening. My name is Ricky Leo. I'm the president of the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. I would like to welcome you to tonight's program. Our guest speaker is Ken Fong. He will be talking about a subject that is near and dear to my heart. My father also served in World War II. I wish I had asked him about his war stories when he was alive. I only found out about his heroic actions after he had already passed away, and after I had registered him for the Congressional Gold Medal for Chinese American World War II veterans. If you are new to CHSSC, I would like to let you know that we were organized in 1975 with a mission of bringing together people with a mutual interest in the history and historical role of Chinese and Chinese Americans in Southern California. In 1994, CHSSC celebrated the 50th anniversary of the ending of World War II by honoring over 60 Chinese American veterans from Southern California. We published the book Duty and Honor as a tribute to these veterans. I want to let you know, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, because we'll have a question and answer session later, led by Eugene Moy. I would now like to turn over the program to Ken.
Thank you so much, Ricky, and thank you to the Chinese Historical Society for inviting me to share this very, as you said, very personal story. Let me jump right in. I titled this little webinar, My Dad, One of the 20,000 plus Invisible Chinese American Heroes of World War II. And I just want to say at the outset that, you know, it's awesome and wonderful that veterans like both of our fathers and so many others were awarded this Congressional Gold Medal. But I still feel like the contribution of Chinese American World War II vets is pretty much invisible. And I hope to build that case. I grew up as the oldest son of James King Fong, who was a second lieutenant in the Army Air Corps, hearing all about his war stories. He wasn't forthcoming, but when we would badger him, he would definitely tell us, me and my two brothers, a lot of these stories. At the same time, I grew up watching television and movies all about World War II. I probably saw most of the movies that came out in the 60s and the 70s. And I had a conflict because no one in these movies.
I can't get the volume on.
Oh,
no sound.
I'm hearing somebody talk.
I don't know how to put.
I know you know nothing. I know that.
Someone needs to mute themselves. I grew up with a conflict because I'm living with a World War II veteran who's telling me all these stories of what he and his fellow veterans did to fight against the Axis powers, but I'm not seeing anyone that looks like my dad on television or on the movie screens. And if you know you're around my age, and if you watch any of these TV shows, you're quite familiar with these images: Combat, the Rat Patrol, even the comedy McHale's Navy. Now, I will have to say that they did have one Asian on there. It was a character who supposedly was I think he was a deserter from the Japanese Navy that was a part of this thing, but clearly only for comic relief, and certainly not an Asian American or Chinese American a seaman or soldier. And then, you know, there was a plethora of movies. I'm sure many of us are familiar with all these movies, but here again, no Chinese Americans, and certainly there was nothing about the whole campaign of the Army Air Corps. So then I thought, okay, well, now finally this movie 12 O'Clock High comes out, starring Gregory Peck, and it's about B-17 crews, which my dad was part of. But here again, all the people in these B-17 bombers were all white men. There were no Asian American men, certainly no one that looked like my dad. So then I got my hopes up again when they made a TV series called 12 O'Clock High. And even though young William Shatner here was part of that whole show, there was no one again that looked like my father. So then I started thinking, okay, that was a long time ago, and there was a lot of racism and erasure and exclusion. But today's World War II storytellers have certainly stopped making Chinese American contribution to the war invisible, right? Well, not so fast. In 2001, Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg came out with a 10-part series on HBO called Band of Brothers, and it was all about the European theater on the ground, and no mention of the 442nd, certainly no mention of Chinese American veterans. Okay, that's 2001. 9 years later, they focused on the war in the Pacific. Many Chinese Americans fought in that war, but here again, nobody was there to represent us on the screen. So imagine my anticipation and hopefulness when this year Masters of the Air came out on Apple TV, and it was all about the whole air campaign, which had not been covered in the previous two movies. And although Hanks and Spielberg went out of their way to have one episode talk about the Tuskegee Airmen, the crews themselves of the B-17s, many of the missions that my dad would talk about and stuff, they were all white men. So even this year, 2024, with everything that has happened, even with the Congressional Gold Medal recognition, the contributions of Chinese American veterans is still not there. As we all know, there are many Chinese American World War II veterans, many of whom are not with us anymore, and as many as 20,000. And yet that number still was not enough to make them part of any of the storytelling that we've seen on our big and small screens. And I want to make the point that is obvious to all of us, but many non-Chinese Americans aren't aware of this, but Chinese Americans were incredibly patriotic back during the war and today. In 1940, the U.S. population of Chinese Americans was only 0.05% of the total population. And yet, 20% or more of Chinese Americans actually served in World War II. I think it's the largest percentage of any ethnic group that participated from America in World War II. And yet, hardly anybody knows about us. I want to back up to tell the story of how my dad actually came to be an American. His father was named King Fong, and he was born in 1871. This is a picture of one of the times when he was coming back on the ship. I think this is the trip when he brought back his wife, my grandmother. His parents are Gui Shu Fong and Shi Fong, and they were from the Huiping or Kaiping region in Guangdong province, China. And he was the youngest of 4 children, all sons. Now, the amazing thing about my grandfather is several things, actually. One, he studied with American missionaries there from a very early age. And they not only taught him to speak, read, and write perfect English, but I think he was inspired by them to cut off his queue even before he left China to come to America. In 1881, he made his first of 3 trips to the U.S. Now, if he was born in 1871, he was like 10, at the most 11 years old when he made his first trip, which just boggles my mind. And he's the youngest child of this family. He was met by his uncle, who was already here in America. And so I think that made it a little bit easier. But he was, even though he didn't have any money in his pocket, he was equipped with quite good English skills. As I said, this was the first of 3 trips. He would make 2 more trips. I think one of the second trip had to be to marry his wife. And then the 3rd trip was to get her to come back with their child. So he married Luke Sim Fong. She was 11 years his junior. And what's significant about their wedding is it was the very first American-style Christian wedding in the region or in the village. And so people who weren't even invited all flocked to this wedding. It was quite the thing because people wanted to see what a American-style Christian wedding was all about. The Reverend John Lake who was a Southern Baptist missionary in Hong Kong, actually came from Hong Kong, and he actually officiated their wedding. In 1918, back in Sacramento, my grandfather formed a business partnership and helped open the Lincoln Market on 4th and K Street in Sacramento. And I think he was part of the whole produce section. If he would have lived longer, he probably would have made out pretty well financially, but you'll hear about what happened. In 1920 around, he went back to China his last time and brought his wife and baby daughter Lily to Sacramento. This is the first time my grandmother had ever left the village. And the story goes that they were on some buckboard or something, and she was crying her eyes out the whole way to the port. And by the time they got to the ship, her eyes were red and puffy. And the captain of the ship says, like, you know, I'm not letting her on. She's got some kind of illness. But somehow they got onto the ship, and she came with him with Lily. My grandfather died in 1932 at the age of 61 from complications of diabetes and tuberculosis. And he left my grandmother, Luke Fong, to raise 5 children by herself in the middle of the Great Depression. She was 49 years old, and she was helped greatly by her church, which was the Chinese Baptist Mission, which later on became the First Chinese Baptist Church, which is, I think, the second oldest Baptist work among Chinese west of the Mississippi. I think it was started as a mission when Abraham Lincoln was president. But if you look in this family portrait here on the right, you see Lily, who was that baby that was brought in her mother's arms in 1918. And you see her here in the picture with the Baptist Mission. Then you see my father, James, with his face partially obscured. You see his next brother, my Uncle Frank, who was already getting taller than his older brother. We don't know why Mabel, number 4, was not in this picture, but the youngest, my Uncle Henry, who is now the only surviving sibling at 92, you know, here in the front row in his little overalls. So think back, it was American missionaries that actually had a huge influence on my grandfather and grandmother. And so when she came here, it was that connection that really made it possible for her to raise these 5 children without an education, without any English skills. Somehow, with their help and her determination, they were able to make it. I love this picture. This is my grandmother. She's probably now close to 60. And this is my dad. This must be shortly after her husband died. And that's his youngest brother, Henry. And I'm sure she made that dress. I recently was directed by my Uncle Henry when I was in Sacramento to find their original house. And he had a separate store that was attached to the house that is still standing today. So that was quite amazing. So after her husband died, she rented out the store area. And one of the things she did, apparently somebody was with a camera and a pony was going around the neighborhood, and she spent some of her hard-earned money to put Uncle Henry on the pony dressed in a cowboy outfit because she wanted him to look American, I guess. She rented out the space of the store to a laundry, the WWII Laundry, which existed there for quite some time. So she was able to get some rental income. I love this formal portrait of her. This is kind of more how she looked when I was growing up. One of the interesting little factoids about this house is she eventually moved out of the house and she rented the upstairs to Chinese American bachelors, one of whom was the future actor Benson Fong. He played, I think, Charlie Chan's #1 son, and he was in Flower Drum Song. I mean, he had quite a number of roles, but when he was a young, struggling bachelor, he was one of the renters of this house. As the oldest son, my dad always had to find ways to earn money. I grew up hearing him tell me stories that I thought he was exaggerating, that he had 3 paper routes and he worked in a slaughterhouse and all these things. But at age 10 or 11, he was the man of the house. And, you know, his mom was just doing what she could. So my dad was always working hard. But he still made time to study, to dance, to play sports, and to work on cars with his friends. But when the Japanese Navy attacked Pearl Harbor, my dad signed up to join the fight because he was an American. First thing he did after enlisting is in the Army Air Corps, he signed up for fighter school. He wanted to be a fighter pilot along with a couple of his Chinese American roommates. And even though our bombers were being shot down in droves because there wasn't enough fighter pilots to protect them, they washed out my dad and his Chinese American roommates. And they didn't say it was for racist reasons. But to this day, I have to believe that's why, because the whole image of a American fighter pilot was a white male. And there was not going to be a Chinese American equivalent to the Tuskegee Airmen. So my dad was very frustrated. Determined to defend his country, he then enrolled in B-17 bomber school. And this was the big 4-engine bomber of World War II. It was a big deal. They quickly learned that my dad was really good at math and physics. And so his primary training was to be a bombardier, but they also trained him to be the navigator, that if he wasn't going to be the bombardier on a mission, he could actually guide the plane to get over the target. This is, again, part of the 8th Air Force. He was in the 351st Bomb Group stationed in Polbrook, England. And I think what was interesting is one of the stories he told us is while he was stationed there, he seriously dated the mayor's daughter of Polbrook. So I was still trying to get my head around that, how this Chinese-American 19, 20-year-old kid is dating the English mayor's daughter of the village that the airfield is located in. But that's my dad. Of the 12,731 B-17s that were built, about 4,735 were lost during the war. And if you think about that, there are 10 crewmen on each plane. So that's almost 50,000 men. They were either killed or they were captured and spent. I think there was over 25,000 American airmen in German POW camps. My dad actually didn't start flying his missions until after D-Day. And he flew 38 missions from August 1944 through January 1945. And this was really to cripple Germany sufficiently so that Hitler would surrender and they would go down in defeat, which ended up being the case. There was the only time my dad would not be invisible during this war. Think about when that would be. It's if he were shot down. Now, as I was growing up, I would go through this cigar box full of my dad's little war trinkets. And one day I found this very yellowed, old counterfeit identification card that were issued to all the different bomber crewmen in case they were shot down behind German lines. And so there was a civilian picture of them in civilian clothes, and it would have like a German name on there. So let's say, you know, his name on the thing was like Helmut Schmidt, okay? And it have some made up stuff on there. And I remember coming to my dad and showing him this card and going, "Dad, what is this for?" He goes, "Oh, well, we were all given that because we were trained that if we were shot down, we would hide our parachute, we'd, you know, get rid of our uniforms, and we either steal clothes off clotheslines or we work with the resistance there and they dress us up. And then we would have these fake papers to help get out of Germany and get back to safe countries." Now, I'm like, "Dad, you actually believe that anyone was going to think that you belonged in Germany? You're a smart guy. This just makes no sense to me." Now, this is an actual picture I found on the internet. Can you spot the escaping Americans? Because there actually are escaping Americans amidst these German soldiers in this picture. They're right there. Imagine my dad dressed like that, but not looking like that with his face. No chance, right? Fortunately, by 1944, the Mustang P-51s had been developed with external drop tanks, so that this allowed them to actually stay with the bombers instead of go back to the base before running out of fuel. And so they were faster than the German fighters, and they were able to actually protect the bombers. If you saw Masters of the Air, and you certainly saw the story of the Bloody 100th, which is related to my dad's bombing group. I mean, they lost over 50% of their planes and their crews, but they were especially flying in the early parts of the war when there was no fighter coverage over the targets. But I think one of the main reasons why my dad survived 38 missions was because they had fighter coverage with them the whole time. One of the stories that I will always remember he told me was he was the lead bombardier for their section. So he's in the lead bomber. He's basically setting the course for all the other bombers in their group to drop their bombs. And so you arm the fuses on these bombs, and then it's bombs away. But my dad was telling me this one time, they're 5 miles in the sky. It is so cold up there that if you touch any metal surface with your skin, it's just going to stick to it and be terribly painful. But he says the bombs were frozen in the racks, but the fuses were already set to go off. And so everyone else is either flying the plane or they're on machine guns and they're shooting at the German fighters. So my dad had to take off his parachute. I think he was still 19 years old. Take off his parachute and crawl down into the bomb bay. And here you can see on the right is the strip of metal. It's about 6 inches wide and then wide open, and you're 5 miles in the sky. And the plane is shuddering and shaking with all the anti-aircraft and, you know, all that kind of stuff going on, the turbulence. And my dad, with no parachute, has a little crowbar, and he's hammering on the ice around the bombs, trying to get them to release and drop onto the target, or at least not be in the plane when they go off. And he finally was able to do it. And as the bombs, these are like 250-pound bombs, as they're dropping on both sides of him, he said, I kind of had to stand, you know, sideways with my arms out, because if these 250-pound bombs just grazed me, I would go down with them, and I don't have a parachute. I said, Dad, how do you do that? How do you not lose your mind? How do you not crap your pants, right? He's just like, you know what? It's something that had to be done, and I was the only person that was able to do it, so I just did it. I was thinking back, what was I doing when I was 19? Nothing even close to what my dad was doing. Then there's the story of the movie star and his invisible combat cameraman. Some of you might know that the biggest movie star at the time was Clark Gable. And he had recently lost his wife in a tragic plane accident. And so even though he's in his 40s, he enlisted, as did many of the big Hollywood stars in those days. And he was assigned to the 351st Squadron as part of a camera crew. But depending on who you talk to, Gable either wanted to go on dangerous missions, but Hollywood and the military wouldn't let him, or he didn't want to go, and they didn't want to let him go anyway. So they would only let Gable go on missions that were basically milk runs. There was no real danger of them being shot at or shot down. So on the real dangerous missions, oftentimes after my dad had dropped the bombs over the target, he would then take the camera and he would shoot a lot of the footage of the target and the missionary and all that stuff. And when they would land, there would be Clark Gable, who was waiting with his little team, and my dad would hand over the film canisters. Now, when Clark Gable entered the Army Air Corps, he entered the same as my dad, a second lieutenant. But as you can see by this DVD cover, which you can find on Amazon, by the time the war was over, he was Major Clark Gable, and my dad was still second lieutenant. And as I looked at this footage, I was telling my dad, you know, I don't even see a photo credit for you. You're nowhere listed as someone who actually took the most dangerous footage. Doesn't that bother you? And he said, no, because I was just doing what I had to do. And that's the way things were back then. So once again, people like my dad and their contributions are still invisible. I want to finish with one of the most enduring lessons that my dad taught me. He roomed with the pilot who was 21 years old, and he was married, and I think he had 2 little kids. My dad was still a bachelor. But sometimes, because of illness or injury, they would need a bombardier on somebody else's plane. And so my dad, on several occasions, was asked to join another crew. And inevitably, those missions where he was on a different plane, his actual plane would get shot up pretty bad or even went down. Well, this one mission, he again was switched. And, they're all lined up. And this is like hundreds of B-17s ready to line up in the dawn of a morning to go off towards Germany. And he knows exactly what his plane is, piloted by his roommate. And he says, one of the things that we all have to do in the morning is we have to take brooms and we have to sweep off the ice and the frost from all the different flight surfaces of our bombers. But, usually the night before a mission, most of the crew is out getting really raging drunk. And so they wake up with terrible hangovers. And this particular mission morning was no different than any other. And so his original crew, all his buddies, they were all complaining. They didn't want to do it. And so the pilot, his roommate, basically kind of let him slack off. He says, so they're about 5 bombers ahead of us. As I see them taxi and go up into the air, all of a sudden it does a 90-degree turn and smashes into the ground and just explodes in a fireball because there was still too much ice on some of the movable surfaces. And my dad told me that story several times, especially later on as I became a leader, as I became a pastor. He said, when you're the leader, you can't always be everyone's friend. And I never forgot that. He says, my roommate, my good friend, he might have been killed on the mission, but he and the rest of the crew did not have to die the way they did. But he needed to stick to his responsibility as their leader, even if they were unhappy with him. That lesson served me quite well as I was in various leadership capacities in my own life. Margaret Cho, the comedian, says the power of visibility can never be underestimated. Again, I said at the outset that it was wonderful and about time that the U.S. government recognized veterans like my father, like your dad, Ricky, as some of these invisible, unsung, quiet heroes of World War II. But the media, and I think most average Americans, they still have no idea. Us Chinese Americans who are related to these veterans, these decorated veterans now, we have a right to be proud, but it's like we're just talking to ourselves. Their contributions, their heroism is still not part of the American story. I want to end by saying that our heroic American stories, all of them, need to be made visible. Not just those who fought in wars and died or survived, but those who were the pioneers, the progenitors, who braved insane amount of suffering and hardships and setbacks in order to carve out a new life in a country that was often hostile to them. So this is a picture again of King Fong, my grandfather, who I never had the privilege to meet because he died when my dad was 10. And this is my Ngingin when she was close to 90. Well, I'd say in her 80s. And I was her oldest son. And this is one of my all-time favorite pictures. She always had that hairnet on. She always seemed to have the same dress. But that smile, so genuine. I miss her a lot. I'm so grateful that at least I got to know her and feel her love. So I just want to end by saying this. Let's make sure that we are seen and included in our country's history. And we just can't expect people who should know better by now to always make the right decisions, to know when they're casting some historic drama, that there are people that were actually part of those stories that need to be included. Because otherwise, as people watch these movies, as they read these stories, when we're not there, when we're invisible, they basically are led to believe that we didn't exist and we didn't do anything. And that's simply not the truth. Well, that's what I have for you today. And I hope that was helpful and interesting.
Well, thank you, Ken. I mean, that's really appreciate hearing this story. There's a lot of background that you have provided, and basically you provided sort of the American migration or diaspora story, in that you shared how your family arrived and how they became involved in community and local society, and then how at least one person served his country. So it's a very important point to drive home. I have fielded only one question. Well, I think I got another one, one that simply said wonderful. But before I read one of the questions, I would like to ask Ken.
Yeah.
So I saw this astounding figure of the number of B-17s that didn't survive, didn't make it.
Yeah.
So I take it then that means that every time that your father began a flight, that what percentage did not return?
Well, they said if you made it to 20 missions, every mission after 20, 80% chance you're not coming back.
Okay.
So let that sink in. I mean, and then after he finished the 38th mission, Eugene, and they were going to send him home, they then asked him to fly B-17s over Japan. And he actually waited, and he goes, I think I've risked my life enough for my country. I'm going home.
Well, there's it's just remarkable, I think, that a young person, a young man, would. Well, I guess there were very strong motivating factors for people for being involved. I mean,
Sure.
There was a definite enemy, and you had to deal with it. So people were showing what stuff they were really made of. It's just kind of incredible that we can hear these stories, but also an important point to drive home, and I think you shared it, was that Chinese Americans became visible during the war because of their involvement in the war. So there was a comment here that said, thank you for sharing. Thank you for this missing part of American history, from Renee, and that's probably someone you know.
Mm-hmm.
I have a comment from Stephanie. And thank you for sharing the story. As a Black Asian American from a military family, I'm painfully aware about the ostracism that Black soldiers faced when they came back from World War II. What challenges did your dad face when he came back? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about the neighborhood that the family lived in. You talked about Sacramento and the Lincoln Market. Who were the customers? What was the surrounding neighborhood like? Maybe you could just comment on that.
What little I'm learning from my Uncle Henry, the youngest, and the survivor, it was a pretty multi-ethnic crowd that would come to the market. Now, the bigger market on Lincoln, that was really Chinese stuff. But I think the little market that was attached to their house, that was much more one of those neighborhood, pick up a loaf of bread kind of thing. If you remember that little picture in front of the W. Chung Laundry that eventually got located there, it looked pretty multi-ethnic. I don't even think anyone from my dad's family was in that picture. So they grew up, a lot with that. when my dad came back, I never heard him say that he had the same kind of GI privileges that helped him buy a house. I've learned stories now where a lot of the white GIs came back and they actually were able to buy their first house because of the government subsidies. I don't know. Maybe Eugene, if the Chinese American veterans had the same thing, because my dad never told me that story. He built our house.
I think I've heard some similar stories. We know of, we've heard of people who built their own houses, whether it was with support from the GI Bill or not. I think that those who served our country in that time period had that maybe courage to really seek, to overcome barriers and take on challenges and make their way through in society. So there's no question that was not uncommon.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you were able to share your story. Gary Leach, well, good to hear your voice on the chat here. We miss getting together at the Chinese Family History Group, but I'm glad to hear your comment, and which was, and I'll read it. Great talk. Your dad truly was a hero. Have you or CHSSC, the Historical Society, thought about writing to Hanks, meaning Tom Hanks or Spielberg, or someone to actually tell their story? This needs to be told to others.
Yeah. When this series first started, I was this close to writing them, right? And it's like, well, I don't even know how to get them. The other thing is the director of the first several episodes was a Hapa Japanese American. Okay. And so then when I saw his name, and he's directed a lot of big things, I'm thinking, okay, you're not just white, you are Asian American. How do you not insist, right, that there is more accurate casting in these episodes that you're directing? So I'm not saying I won't. I know, it took them how many years to film this with all the special effects and everything. So obviously they're not going to go back and edit scenes and, just put in Chinese American characters. But I think stories like my dad's, and his is just one, stories like my dad's are fascinating, and they're part of the American storybook.
Yeah. And in the audience here, there's lots of friends who I know have stories behind them, whether it's Linda or Cindy or Bill Watanabe out there, Margie and Michael Kwan. Oh, by the way, Michael, we'll have to talk. There is going to be a little program at the Santa Barbara Cemetery on Sunday, so you might want to join in. There are just so many stories to be told. It's just that, and Margie Lee is out in the audience, and maybe 20 years ago, she was involved with our major World War II veterans project, producing the book Duty and Honor. But we also know that there are many untold stories beyond what took 3 years to put together. And there's just so much more. And there's just, and World War II wasn't the end of our Chinese American involvement in service.
Sure.
Military service. Many then followed World War II by going straight into Korea, and then later many in Vietnam and other arenas throughout the world. So, in fact, I was just walking back from an activity in Chinatown, and I ran across Wayne Louis. I know that Wayne Yi, I know you're out there, and Margie, you're out there. But so I saw a member of American Legion Post 628 out there, and I'm hoping that the American Legion Post will continue to establish a presence and visibility in Chinatown.
Yes.
we're hoping that we can do that.
I see a question here from Cindy about whether my dad ever got together with his crew after the war.
Yes.
And not that I know of, but here's something interesting. So this is maybe, I'm like 15 years old. So this is maybe 20 years after the war at least. And we're just at home in Sacramento in the home that my dad built. And there's someone at our front door ring the doorbell. And it's this tall white guy, young man. And he says, "Does James Fong live here?" And he was like, "Yeah." He's like, "My dad was a pilot on one of the planes that your dad was a crew for. And then that was one of those planes that got shot down when my dad was on another plane, and he never saw the chutes open. He assumed that his friend, the pilot, was dead. In fact, he had actually lived out the rest of the war in POW camp. And he told his son, when he had him, stories about this. His son then went to the Air Force Academy, had just graduated, bought his car, and decided to look in the white pages for the chance that he actually might meet my father, and showed up at our front door."
Yeah. I think having the shared experience really builds fellowship.
Well, I think when Bill Watanabe is asking, did my dad experience much hostility? He never talked about that. And what I did hear, just to your point, Eugene, he said, when you're up there 5 miles in the sky and you're relying on each other, I mean, there is nothing more real than that. It really, whatever racism you might have had because of, the physical differences, cultural differences, it pretty much disappeared.
Yeah. Well, yeah, interestingly, you hear sometimes some stories about people who were on opposing sides meeting after the war,
Yeah.
much later, and just realizing the humanity that binds all of us, but somehow, due to circumstances, world politics, people do get caught up in these. There is another comment from Brian. Excuse me for turning my head, but I have to read.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your father's story, Kenny. So that's somebody who knows you.
Yeah, from Sacramento. That's my Sacramento name. Yeah.
I knew more about the Japanese Americans 442nd up until now. So I'm incredibly fortunate to learn about other Asians' contributions. Having met your mom and dad during our university years, I feel that much more connected. Thanks again. And this is from
Brian.
Classmate Brian.
Yeah, he and I were roommates at Berkeley. Yeah, he knows more about Japanese culture than most Japanese people, but he had Chinese American roommates, but we just didn't know our stories back then.
Yeah. And by the way, I'm not sure if we really shared your bio at the beginning, but you were at Cal at early on, and then you had a degree in biology, moved to LA. You attended and graduated from Fuller Theological Seminary with a master in divinity and a doctorate in the ministry, and then you helped lead Evergreen Baptist Church of LA to become one of the first English-only multi-ethnic majority pan-Asian churches in America. So I guess you've been a witness to a lot of changes in our society, and perhaps, and I wonder, did your father encourage you to go in this direction of embracing the diverse parts of our community?
I don't think he ever explicitly pushed anything like that, right? But clearly, how he conducted himself, his circle of friends, his workmates at McClellan Air Force Base, for his whole post-war career. Yeah, my dad was pretty fluid in being able to move around, even though, when his mom was still alive, she can only speak Cantonese, right? But most of the time when he's interacting with us and all his other friends, he's always speaking English. But I think one of the things that at this stage of my life, I'm 69 now, Eugene. One of the things I'm realizing and appreciating, I was much closer to my mom growing up than my dad, even though I loved hearing his war stories. But I'm realizing now at this stage of my life how much I'm like my dad. And one of the things, that lesson I shared at the end about what it means to be a leader sometimes, is you can't just try to be popular or make everybody happy. You have to make tough decisions because tough things need to get done. I feel like his example, really, I must have just marinated in it for so long. Like he never just took the easy way because he wanted an easy way. He took the way that needed to be taken. And I feel like I did that in my pastoral career. I think I'm still trying to do that today.
Well, I'm hoping that you can continue sharing so that we learn how to share with each other, and programs like this really help. There are several other questions I'd like to. What time is it now? I think we still have time. So
Okay.
let's
Sure.
go through some of these. Gary again asks, which book or books best represent what he endured as a bombardier? I think you sort of described a little bit of
Yeah.
the how challenging it was to launch a bomb.
Well, one of the things that I really came to appreciate was when you're so many minutes from the target, and you see it in Masters of the Air, the pilot actually switches control of the plane to the bombardier. And so the bombardier is actually steering the plane. So again, you talk about everyone else on the plane having to rely on each other. Well, they really had to rely on the bombardier. I mean, why are they all risking their life if they're not even going to come close to the target? And my dad ended up being the lead bombardier. So he's leading the whole bunch of bombers, right? They're all keying off of him. There's a book, I don't know, it's like something over Polebrook. It's been years since I read it. And it was written actually from someone who was stationed at the RAF field in Polebrook where my dad was. So if you do a search on Amazon for World War II in Polebrook, you'll come up with that. I would say one of the best documentaries that I've seen is called Blue Air. And it's actual footage of B-17s that they've color corrected and made better clarity. And they tell the whole story with actual footage, no CG, no actors, what have you. And it's been several years since I've seen it, but it's quite moving when you want to get a picture of what that was like.
Did you have to be good in math to be a bombardier? Did you
Yeah.
have to calculate?
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I think that's why they were so quick to take my dad, even though he had gotten washed out of fighter school. It was like, oh, yeah. And that, that whole northern bomb site, that, I don't know everything. I don't know hardly anything about how that worked, but you have to do all of this geometry in order to, zero into where you're going to drop this. And my understanding is they would hit bombs away when they're still like 4 kilometers from the target. So the bombs are sailing through the air, with the velocity of the planes and the motion, all that. So still pretty difficult. The British were actually flying only night missions. It was the Americans that were flying the daytime missions. And that's why they were getting, shot to mincemeat before the fighter escorts came.
One of our late Historical Society members, Fred Gong, was a bombardier. And I understood from hearing his stories that, he had to be trusted and reliable in order to hit his targets, and he always hit his targets. But I didn't realize that sometimes that you would have this open bay,
Yeah,
where you could just drop down.
right.
That was something that I had no idea. I thought he would be in some enclosed space, and all he had to do was push a button.
No. Well, if you saw that photograph I put up, that was an actual B-17. I went up in one to experience it. I sat in my dad's chair, right? And the favorite tactic of German fighters was to come at the bombers head on, because that was the least coverage by machine guns. And the bombardier is sitting in this plexiglass bubble. Now, the rest of the plane is thin sheet metal, so it's not like you're going to get, that much more protection. But just the sense of vulnerability is insane.
Well,
Yeah.
it just shows how what people face. Let me share another story.
Oh,
Well, if
Gene,
you're,
Gene,
yeah, yes.
another great book is by Russell Lowe. It's called The All-American Crew.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. B-24.
Yeah, that's an excellent book if you want to know how it was like, to be a bomber and fly on those bombing missions.
Yeah.
I
And-
interviewed Russell about that book on my podcast. So if people want to check it out, they
Yeah.
can find
Yeah.
that.
Why did you type it in there?
Yeah. And so that presentation, is that on our YouTube channel, Ricky?
No, we couldn't record his
Oh,
meetings
okay.
because of copyright
Okay.
issues.
All right. So anyway, then get the book.
Yeah, right.
Which will support.
Listen to my episode.
Yeah. Another comment, Jean Burns comments that her dad got an accounting degree with the GI Bill, but then he was unable to get a job in accounting. So, a lot of
Yeah.
people who got an education still face challenges, even after coming back and having served their country.
Yeah. Yeah. I think my dad had a gas station. I just found this out like 2 months ago. My dad had a gas station in the old neighborhood soon after he came out of the war. And I think because he liked fixing cars, but that didn't last. And then he ended up being a mechanic at McClellan Air Force Base, and he married my mom and built the house. And then when they had my sister, my mom was like, you cannot be a mechanic and we're not going to be able to make it. And so she encouraged him to go to night school. And he was one of the first people to learn Fortran and all that computer language. And so that's when he became a systems analyst at McClellan Air Force Base.
I feel old now because I learned Fortran too. Fortran 1 and Fortran 2. But anyway, and Helen Kwan says, oh, yes, my father received money to buy the first house.
Nice.
To service.
Okay.
So others were helped. And then Cindy has come back too, and she had another comment for Asian American Month. LA County has requested Montgomery Hong to display an Asian Americans in military service exhibit, apparently, that will open at the Bob Hope Patriotic Hall, which is in downtown on Figueroa, beginning May 6th until mid-June.
Oh, wow.
Please watch the Historical Society emails in future announcements. And so I guess we will post that announcement. And thank you, Cindy, for that. Wayne Yi, regarding Chinese using the GI Bill after World War II, as I was told, many were not here with legitimate papers. In other words, even some people who were not even didn't have citizenship papers, and with McCarthyism going on at that time, late 40s and early 50s, that it was not feasible for many, not possible for many to apply for the GI Bill benefits. So that was a challenge that some people face.
Okay.
Yeah, but your father didn't have that challenge, it looks like. And then another question from Michael: because of the large numbers, much has been said Blacks were denied their VA privileges following World War II. So I guess it's always, maybe it has been a challenge for many to get through the VA system. Did your father or any others in your family take advantage of VA benefits?
Yeah, his next brother, my Uncle Frank, did. I was just talking to the youngest brother, my Uncle Henry, and he's like, I still, to this day, don't understand why my brother Frank used his GI benefits to go to the Kodak School of Photography when he was not planning to be a professional photographer. He was just like a serious amateur. And so he was like, why? Why would you do that? You moved to Rochester, New York, right? You learn all this darkroom stuff, but you're not planning to be a professional photographer. So I heard that story, but I never heard my dad talk about it. And I think by the time he went to night school to learn Fortran and stuff, I think there must have been some limit to how long after the war you could use your GI benefits.
Well, yeah, I don't know if that's been replaced by other bills for subsequent, military engagements. So Ricky added that on the Patriotic Hall exhibit, Ricky, your father, Louis Ging Thin, also known as Sonny Leo, will be featured in an exhibit as well. So beginning May 6th, we should all head over to Patriotic Hall and see that exhibit. Let's see. Doreen Wong, Ken, I love hearing about your dad's World War II story. I tried to share your dad's story in Germany and Austria. So it looks like some of this is being broadcast out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, her father served in the Pacific, and get this, Eugene, he was captured and made a POW twice by the U.S. forces. They accused him of being a Japanese spy.
Well, yeah. Well, I have heard that some folks who did serve during the war ended up behind the lines because there was concern about friendly fire.
Oh my, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'll be a clerk typist.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a little bit safer.
Sure.
Or be the cook, that
Yep.
feeds the crew. So another comment from Peter Chen. I won an award for this documentary about Chinese American hero called Doolittle Raiders Revisited on YouTube.com. So Doolittle Raiders Revisited. So maybe some of you listening can go take a look at that. They won
yeah,
an award at the Skyfest 7 Festival.
nice.
Yeah, and it's on YouTube. And then let's see what I'm trying to read this official selection for the Doolittle. So I think just look up the title, everyone, and then you can
Yeah.
see.
I see someone's asking if my dad suffered from PTSD, right? And I would say, one, we didn't have that terminology back then. My dad was always quiet, and one of the things I really learned is he didn't glorify the war experience at all. And I think he said very clearly, people who've actually fought in a war, whether your side won or lost, you never glorify it. It's so horrid. And so again, my brothers and I, we'd have to like pull these stories out of him. But other than that, I never heard anything about sleepless nights. He never had a drinking problem. He was able to keep and hold good jobs. So one thing he did say, I mean, for all the years I regaled hearing these stories, one day it hit me, Eugene. I go, Dad, you've killed people. Like, does that bother you? And he said, if I actually was on the ground and I had to aim a gun at somebody and pull the trigger and see them die, I think I couldn't handle that. He says, I knew people were dying from the bombs we were dropping, but we're so far removed, right? We're 5 miles in the sky that I was able to cope with it. I think it's more the trauma, especially after watching Masters of the Air and Blue Air and all that. It's more seeing your buddies blown up, like planes blown up all around you, people horribly maimed and killed. Just the horror of the battles themselves, not so much from pulling triggers and killing people.
Well, given some of the conflicts that we're seeing worldwide, I don't want to end this on a low note. We're hopeful that people will come and find ways to sit at the table and engage and really find solutions. So that we ourselves or our children or grandchildren don't have to face that. A comment here, Doreen says, after my father served in the Pacific, he was not able to rent an apartment. As he told me, it was due to prejudice. He had to sleep at the YMCA for several months. He eventually received GI benefits. So it kind of tells us that not only do we have to negotiate our way through worldwide conflicts, but we still have to negotiate our way through our communities and our neighborhoods.
Yeah.
So I think that we hopefully all can be as welcoming and do the best we can to communicate with our neighbors. It's about what time is it?
It's 8:02.
8:02. So I've gone through most of the questions, and I think that we really addressed quite a bit. And I think it's time to call it an evening, but we're going to first pass the camera and the microphone over to Susan Dixon, our past president, who has been the VP of programs, and she'll announce our next program meeting. But again, as I have done before previously, I still need to work with our Yosemite Pilgrimage Committee to really work on the details for our Yosemite pilgrimage. But let me stop myself. First of all, everyone, please, I'd like to give a round of applause to Ken and Pastor Ken, and thank you for really sharing your father's and family's experience. We really enjoyed the story, and so Ken, if we could do a standing ovation, we would. And thank you, audience, for joining in. And I know that we haven't been able to have in-person meetings. I just see so many names, whether it's Linda or Margie or Don. Don, but I have a comment for you. Let's talk a little bit more. I just need to follow up on something. So please, let's just get together again. And by the way, if you all want to drop in at the Historical Society on Sunday afternoons, we have open house, we have our library, we have exhibits. Many people come in and to do a little research or to chat, just simply, and some of our friends and neighbors will bring in little snacks for us, and we'll make some coffee. So please join, drop in when you can. Anyway, I myself will bid good evening to everyone, and I'll pass this on to Susan Dixon for next month's program.
Okay, we actually have two programs that we're sponsoring for in the next coming month. So first, there's a book launch at the Pico House. We are sponsoring our partner Chinese American Museum. Will Gao, who is an assistant professor in ethnic studies at Cal State Sacramento. He was a former board member. He's worked on projects for us, currently working on the 5 Chinatowns project. And his book is called Performing Chinatown. The event will be at the Pico House Sunday, May 19th at 10:30. And if you are interested in buying his book, you could go online to our newsletter and find the link so that you could get 20% off. And then our next monthly meeting is June 5th at 7 p.m. on Zoom. And we will have Lorraine Dong. She's an Asian American Studies department in the Asian American Studies department at San Francisco State. And she will be talking about the Chinese Square and Circle Club, which is celebrating 100 years on June 15th. And it is the oldest Chinese American women's service organization in the nation. So I think it will be very interesting. She is the sister of filmmaker Arthur Dong and our own Laureen Dong, who's on our board. So I think it would be very interesting if you could join and support us. And then there are many of you that are not members. So please think that we do this, we do important work, and maybe that you could be a part of our organization. So please have a good evening, and thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Good to see you all.
Good night.
Good night.